The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest Coast are composed of many nations and tribal affiliations, each with distinctive cultural and political identities, but they share certain beliefs, traditions and practices, such as the centrality of salmon as a resource and spiritual symbol. The term Northwest Coast or Northwest Coast is used in anthropology to refer to the groups of indigenous people residing along the coast of British Columbia, Washington State, parts of Alaska, Oregon, and Northern California. The term Pacific Northwest is largely used in the American context. Prior to the contact with Westerners, warfare between nations and the enslaving of captives was also an enterprise common to many of the groups. At one point the region had the highest population density of a region inhabited by Aboriginal peoples in Canada. List of tribes. The Pacific Northwest Coast at one time had the most densely populated areas of indigenous people ever recorded in Canada. The land and waters provided rich natural resources through cedar and salmon, and highly structured cultures developed from relatively dense populations. Within the Pacific Northwest, many different nations developed, each with their own distinct history, culture, and society. Some cultures in this region were very similar and share certain elements, such as the importance of salmon to their cultures, while others differed. Prior to contact, and for a brief time after colonization, some of these groups regularly conducted war against each other through raids and attacks. Through warfare they gathered captives for slavery. The are one of the furthest north indigenous nations in the Pacific Northwest Coast. Their autonym is Tlingit, meaning human being. The Russian name for them, Koloshi, was derived from an Alush term for the labret, and the related German name, Quileute, may be encountered in older historical literature. The Tillamook are a matrilineal society. They developed a complex hunter-gatherer culture in the temperate rainforest of the Alaska Panhandle and adjoining inland areas of present-day British Columbia and Yukon. Nisgaa. The Zetsort were an Athabascan people whose territory was at the head of the Portland Canal. Little is known about them. Decimated by raiding and disease, the survivors were absorbed into the Nisgaa. The latter people now hold the former territories as they are now extinct. The Haida people are well known as skilled artisans of wood, metal and design. They have also shown much perseverance and resolve in the area of forest conservation. The vast forests of cedar and spruce where the Haida make the home are on pre-glacial land, which is believed to be almost 14,000 years old. Haida communities located in Prince of Wales Island, Alaska, and Haida Gwaii also share a common border with other indigenous peoples, such as the Tillamook and the Tsimshian. The Haida were also famous for the long-distance raiding and slaving, reaching as far as Mexico. Tsimshian. The Tsimshian, translated as people inside the Skeena River, are indigenous people who live around Terrace and Prince Rupert on the north coast of British Columbia, and the southernmost corner of Alaska on Annette Island. There are about 10,000 Tsimshian, of which about 1,300 live in Alaska. Succession in Tsimshian society is matrilineal, and one's place in society was determined by one's clan or phratrie. Four main Tsimshian clans formed the basic phratrie. The Laxjiak and Ganhada form one half. Gispverdwada and Laxjabu form the other half. Prior to European contact, marriage in Tsimshian society could not take place within a half-group, for example between a wolf and a killer whale. It was considered to be incest even if there was no blood relationship. Marriages were only arranged between people from clans in different halves, for example, between the killer whale and a raven or eagle. Giteksan. The Giteksan or Giksan, meaning people of the Skeena River, were known with the Nisgaa as Interior Tsimshian. They speak a closely related language to Nisgaa, though both are related to Coast Tsimshian. This is the English term for Tsimshian spoken on the coast. Although inland, their culture is part of the Northwest Coast culture or area, and they share many common characteristics, including the clan system, an advanced art style, and war canoes. They share an historic alliance with the neighboring Wet'suwet'en, a subgroup of the Dakel. Together they waged a battle in the courts against British Columbia known as Delgamuukw v. the Queen, which had to do with land rights. The Hyla are an indigenous nation living at Kitimat in the North Coast region of the Canadian province of British Columbia. The name Hyla is derived from the Hyla word Xaila or Xaisala, living at the river mouth, living down river. Hartsock. The Hartsock are an indigenous nation of the Central Coast region of the Canadian province of British Columbia, centered on the island communities of Bilabella, British Columbia, and Clemtu. The Hartsock are the descendants of a number of tribal groups who came together in Bilabella in the 19th century. They generally prefer the autonym Hartsock. Anthropology labeled them the Belabella, which is how they are more widely known. Nuxalk. The Nuxalk, also known as the Bilkula, are an indigenous people of the Central Coast. They are the furthest north of the coast Salish cultures. Linguists have classified them as independent of both interior and coast Salish language groups. Their language is a Salishan language, very different from that of the coastal neighbors. It is believed to have been more related to interior Salish, in a historical connection before the Athabascan-speaking groups now inland from them spread southwards. Wuk'innuxtva. The Wuk'innuxtva, also known as the Okinawa River's inlet people, speak a parallel language to Hartsock, Wukyala or Ovekyala. Together with the Hartsock and Hyla, they were once incorrectly known as the Northern Quileute because of the language's close relationship with Kwakewala. Greatly reduced in numbers today, like other coastal peoples, they were master carvers and painters. They had an elaborate ritual and clan system. The focus of the territory was Owikino Lake, a freshwater fjord above a short stretch of river at the head of River's Inlet. Kwakwaka'wakw. The Kwakwaka'wakw are an indigenous people, numbering about 5,500, who live in British Columbia on northern Vancouver Island and the mainland. The autonym they prefer is Kwakwaka'wakw. Their indigenous language, part of the Wakashan languages family, is Kwakewala. The name Kwakwaka'wakw means speakers of Kwakewala. The language is now spoken by less than 5% of the population, about 250 people. Today 17 separate tribes make up the Kwakwaka'wakw, who historically spoke the common language of Kwakewala. Some Kwakwaka'wakw groups are now extinct. Kwakewala is a northern Wakashan language, a grouping shared with Hyla, Hartsock and Ovekyala. New Chanal. The New Chanal are indigenous peoples in Canada. The traditional home is in the Pacific Northwest on the west coast of Vancouver Island. In pre-contact and early post-contact times, the number of nations was much greater, but as in the rest of the region, smallpox and other consequences of contact resulted in the disappearance of some groups, and the absorption of others into neighboring groups. They were among the first Pacific peoples north of California to come into contact with Europeans. Competition between Spain and the United Kingdom over control of Nootka Sound led to a bitter international dispute around 1790, which was settled when Spain agreed to abandon its claim of exclusivity to the North Pacific coast, and to pay damages for British ships seized during the dispute. The New Chanal speak a Southern Wakashan language and are closely related to the Maka and Ditadat. Maka. The Maka are Southern Wakashan people and are closely related to the New Chanal. They are also noted as whalers. The territory is around the northwest tip of the Olympic Peninsula. Coast Salish. The Coast Salish are the largest of the southern groups. They are a loose grouping of many tribes with numerous distinct cultures and languages. Territory claimed by Coast Salish people spans from the northern end of the Strait of Georgia along the east side of Vancouver Island, covering most of southern Vancouver Island, all of the lower mainland and Sunshine Coast, all of Puget Sound except for the Chinookan territory near Port Townsend, and all of the Olympic Peninsula except that of the Quileute, related to the now extinct Chinookan. The Strait of Georgia and Puget Sound were officially united as the Salish Sea in 2010. The Coast Salish cultures differ considerably from those of the northern neighbors. It is one of the few indigenous cultures along the coast with a patrilineal, not matrilineal, culture. They are also one of the few peoples on the coast whose traditional territories coincide with contemporary major metropolitan areas, namely the North Strait Salish-speaking peoples in and around Victoria, the Hartsock-speaking peoples in and around Vancouver, and the Quileute-speaking peoples in and around Seattle. Pre-European contact. The Coast Salish numbered in the tens of thousands, and as such were one of the most populous groups on the northwest coast. Chinookan. The Chinookan people were a Chinookan-speaking people whose traditional territory lay in the area of Port Townsend, Washington, beset by warfare from surrounding Salish peoples. The last major presence in the region was eradicated by the Suquamish under Chief Seattle in the mid-19th century. Some survivors were absorbed by neighboring Salish peoples, while some moved to join the Quileute on the southeast side of the Olympic Peninsula. Quileute. The Quileute, Quileute, are a Chinookan-speaking people. The traditional territory is in the western Olympic Peninsula, around the Quileute and Hoh rivers. Willapa. The Willapa are traditionally Athabascan-speaking people of southwestern Washington. The territory was between Willapa Bay and the prairie lands around the head of the Chehalis and Quileute rivers. A related people, known as the Tlaxcani, Tletiskna, or Tlaxcani, lived on the south side of the Columbia River in northwestern Oregon. Chinook. The Chinookan peoples were once one of the most powerful and populous groups of tribes on the southern part of the northwest coast. Their territories flank the mouth of the Columbia River and stretch up that river in a narrow band adjacent to that river, as far as Celilo Falls. A group of dialects are known as Chinookan. It is distinguished from the Chinook jargon, which was partly based upon it, and is often called Chinook. Close allies of the New Channel peoples, they are also a Canoe people and pre-European contact. Chinook jargon arose as a trading language incorporating both Chinookan and Wakashan vocabulary. The Chinookan peoples practiced slavery, likely learned from the New Channel, as it was more common to the north, and cranial deformation. Those without flattened heads were considered to be beneath or servile to those who had undergone the procedure as infants. One likely reason for the cultural prominence of the Chinookan peoples was the strategic position along the Columbia River, which acted as a massive trade corridor, as well as near Celilo Falls, the longest continuously inhabited site in the Americas, used as a fishing site and trading hub for 15,000 years by a wide range of indigenous peoples. Tillamook. The Tillamook and Nephilim peoples were a Coast Salishan-speaking group of tribes living roughly between Tillamook Head and Cape Meares on the northern Oregon coast. The term Tillamook itself is in fact an exonym for the neighboring Chinook-speaking Cathlamet people. Although the Tillamook language was a Coast Salish language, it was somewhat divergent from its more northerly cousins. Likewise, the Tillamook culture was substantially different from that of other Coast Salish cultures, apparently influenced by its southern neighbors. They, and the southern neighbors, were less reliant on salmon runs and more reliant on and fish trapping in estuaries, hunting, and shellfish gathering. History. The area referred to as the Northwest Coast has a very long history of human occupation, exceptional linguistic diversity, population density, and cultural and ceremonial development. Noted by anthropologists for its complexity, there is emerging research that the economies of these people were more complex and intensive than was previously assumed. Many groups have first-generation stories, family stories that tell of the origin of the group, and often of humans themselves arising in specific locations along the coast. The Indian history of British Columbia began at least 100 centuries before the province itself was born. Wilson, on the northwest coast of North America, the mild climate and abundant natural resources made possible the rise of a complex Aboriginal culture. The people who lived in what are today British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon were able to obtain a good living without much effort. They had time and energy to devote to the development of fine arts and crafts and to religious and social ceremonies. Prior to European colonization, various reports from European explorers described the tribes in the area bearing signs of smallpox. Nathaniel Portlock, a British ship's captain, described as having expected to have seen a numerous tribe, but instead found only of 3 men, 3 women, as well as the oldest of the men marked with the smallpox. When referring to the Tlingit people in the northwest coast, oral traditions of various tribes in the Pacific Northwest also refer to an epidemic of smallpox on the populations. There are many theories to how smallpox arrived in the Pacific Northwest. One theory is that an outbreak in central Mexico in 1779 spread north and infected the Shoshone in 1781, allowing the disease to spread into the lower Columbia River and Georgia Strait via trade between the Flathead, Nez Perce, Walla Walla, and other various tribes. Spanish expeditions to the northwest coast from Mexico in 1774, 1775, and 1779 are also attributed to spreading smallpox to the local tribes in the area, with many documented outbreaks correlating to where the Spanish made landfall. Another theory describes the outbreak originating in the Kamchatka Peninsula in 1769 and spreading via Russian explorers to South Alaska and the Aleutians, thus through the Alaska Panhandle and down the Pacific coast. Due to the native population having no prior exposure to Old World diseases, local tribes could have lost as much as 90% of the population. This depopulation enabled an easier colonization of the Pacific Northwest by European and American migrants. European colonization. Current times. Since colonization, the political and current context of life for these indigenous peoples varies, especially considering the relationship to Canada and the United States. In Canada, indigenous people, First Nations, are one of the fastest growing groups with a young and growing population. Significant issues persist as a result of colonial laws and the now infamous Indian residential school system. Many of the most repressive elements of the Indian Act were removed in 1951 and the vote was granted in 1960. The 1951 amendment to the Indian Act lifted the potlatch ban. Though never fully effective, it had pushed traditional culture underground. Since 1951, ceremonial practices and the potlatch have re-emerged widely along the coast. One development in recent times is the revival of ocean-going cedar canoes. Beginning in the late 1980s with early Haida and Hartsock canoes, the revival spread quickly after the paddle to Seattle in 1989 and the 1993 Catuas Canoe Festival in Bella. Many other journeys have taken place to different places along the coast, in voyages that have come to be known as tribal journeys. Culture. Potlatch. A potlatch is a highly complex event where people gather in order to commemorate a specific event. These potlatches would usually be held in competition with one another, providing a forum to display wealth within a tribe. In the potlatch ceremony, the chief would give highly elaborate gifts to visiting peoples in order to establish his power and prestige, and by accepting these gifts the visitors conveyed their approval of the chief. There were also great feasts and displays of conspicuous consumption, such as the burning of articles, or throwing things into the sea, purely as a display of the great wealth of the chief. Groups of dancers put on elaborate dances and ceremonies. These dancers were members of secret dancing societies. Watching these performances was considered an honor. Potlatches were held for several reasons: the confirmation of a new chief, coming of age, tattooing or piercing ceremonies, initiation into a secret society, marriages, the funeral of a chief, battle victory. Music. Among the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest coast, the music varied in function and expression. As some groups have more cultural differences than the rest, there remains a lot of similarities. Some instruments used by the indigenous were hand drums made of animal hides, plank drums, log drums, box drums, along with whistlers, wood clappers, and rattles. A great deal of the instruments were used mostly in the potlatch, but also carried over into other festivities throughout the year. The songs employed are used with dancing, although it is also for celebration, which at times may not be accompanied by dancing. Most singing is community-based. There are some solo parts. Often the lead singer would begin in the first line of each round of a song, but not long solos. For some ceremonies, solo songs would be used by men and women without the accompaniment of any person or drum, usually slow in tempo and accompanied by a drum. Principal function of music in this area is spiritual. Music honors the earth, creator, ancestors, all aspects of the supernatural world. Sacred songs are not often shared with the wider world. Women and men, families owned their own songs as property which can be inherited, sold or given as a gift to a prestigious guest at a feast. Professionals existed for some communities, but music is taught and then rehearsed. For some nations, the tradition was those who made musical errors were punished, usually through shaming, employing octave singing, but rather than running up and down the scale. It is not uncommon to jump notes and go from bottom to top or top to bottom in a couple of notes. Vocal rhythmic patterns are often complex and run counter to rigid percussion beats. The tribes would dance in groups in circles. Art. The creation of beautiful and practical objects served as a means of transmitting stories, history, wisdom and property from generation to generation. Art provided indigenous people with a tie to the land by depicting the histories on totem poles, the big houses of the Pacific Northwest coast. The symbols depicted were a constant reminder of the birthplaces, lineages and nations. Due to the abundance of natural resources and the affluence of most Northwest tribes, there was plenty of leisure time to create art. Many works of art served practical purposes, such as clothing, tools, weapons of war and hunting, transportation, cooking, and shelter, but others were purely aesthetic. Pacific Northwest coast. Spiritualism, the supernatural and the importance of the environment played integral roles in day-to-day life. Therefore, it was not unusual for the worldly goods to be adorned with symbols, crests and totems that represented some important figure from both the seen and unseen worlds. Often different northern tribes would adorn the possessions with symbols that represented a tribe as a collective. This would often be a signal of differentiation among tribal groups. Such symbols could be compared to a coat of arms, or running up the flag of a country on a sailing ship as it approached a harbor. After the arrival of the Europeans, indigenous artifacts suddenly became a hot commodity to be collected and placed in museums and other institutions, and many tribal groups were looted of the precious items by overzealous collectors. It is only in recent years that many native organizations have been calling for a return of some of the sacred items, such as masks and regalia, that symbolize the cultural heritage. Genetics. Haplogroup Q1A3A is a Y-chromosome haplogroup generally associated with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The QM3 mutation appears on the Q lineage roughly 10 to 15,000 years ago, as the migration throughout the Americas was underway by the early Paleo-Indians. The Nardenne Inuit and indigenous Alaskan populations exhibit haplogroup Q mutations, however, which are distinct from other indigenous Amerindians along with various mtDNA mutations. This suggests that the migrant ancestors of the current inhabitants of the northern extremes of North America and Greenland derived from later migrant populations.